And gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Tokyo. Hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. This is a live from the APO Secretariat Office in Tokyo, Japan, and we welcome all our viewers from APO member countries and beyond. I am Osaitambi Monikam, and thanks to our viewers for joining us today on this APO Productivity series. And today we will focus on how COVID-19 is affecting the rice-based agri-food systems. To discuss this topic, I am honored to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Jean Balie from International Rice Research Institute, Manila, Philippines. Though Dr. Jean is working in Philippines, currently he is joining us from France. Dr. Jean, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Very well. Thank you.
How is the COVID situation in France? Hope it's getting better gradually.
Yes, gradually, getting better, like other European countries. Thank you.
Thank you. So Dr. Jean, actually, he's working as an acting director of research in IRRI. And before joining IRRI, he was working with the United Nations FAO for almost more than 16 years under different positions like a senior economist, research program leader. And before we get into the topic, and I will let me share my small video clip from Thailand news channel on how COVID-19 is affecting the labor availability in Thailand farms due to the migrant laborers returning to their home countries like Cambodia and Myanmar. Let's have a look. As you have seen, COVID-19 is affecting Thailand's agriculture sector very badly due to the non-availability of migrant labor resources, almost 4 million resources across the border. And the rice crop production activities like the planting and the harvesting got affected. And which will have a huge impact on the rice output. On top of that, Thailand is facing a severe drought this year, and which leads to the skyrocketing prices like commodity prices like rice. Thai rice prices have been tripled within this year, beginning of this. And this situation of Thailand is similar across all our Asian member countries. And because of the COVID affected, hugely affected our food supply chain, crop production, logistics, and all food value chains. Since rice is the staple food for more than half of our world's populations, we have to produce more rice to feed our growing population under different challenges like a global climate change, in addition with the unprecedented crisis like COVID-19. So in today's talk, Dr. Jean will give his views on COVID-19 will affect rice supply and demand, price fluctuations, on market fundamentals, as well as the governments may consider during this crisis. Before I invite Dr. Jean to start his presentation, we would like to encourage all our viewers to send your questions and comments to Dr. Jean in the chat box with your name and country, and he will answer during Q&A session. Dr. Jean, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asai. Thank you very much for these introductory remarks. I think you have set the scene very well. This video is a very good illustration of the situation in Asia, but also in other parts of the world. I think it's a very useful starting point to actually talk about the situation. So let me go to my slides and present. As you know, the crisis is now a global crisis. We have 188 countries that are currently affected out of 195 countries in the world. More than or close to 5.5 million cases that have been recognized, and sadly, nearly 346,000 people who have died of the virus or related causes. So that's a very concerning picture. So we have the first point I wanted to make is that we have moved, and that should not go unnoticed, from a situation where we started with a health crisis, but it has become a global economic, social, and political crisis. So we have seen that not a single sector is impacted directly or indirectly. Agriculture is no exception. Although in a number of cases, governments have made efforts to actually protect the supply chains in agriculture from the lockdowns, they have been affected also. There are also very important variations in the way the sectors, people have been impacted. Macro level differences, micro level differences. Some households have been more affected than others. So all those are very important nuances. And sadly, we have also seen that social inequalities have compounded the crisis. And the crisis has also aggravated social inequalities. And that may have important consequences for the future. And probably more importantly for the future steps in fighting the crisis, the COVID, but also in putting together a new order. We have seen geopolitical and political tensions globally, with fierce criticisms to the multilateral system, and more trends towards national solution, national sovereignty. So all these are elements that need to be looked at in the way we look at the impact of the crisis in the rice sector or rice-based agri-food systems. So the one thing that I wanted to start with is to discuss what I call the uncharted territories. Basically, the one key message from this crisis is that we don't know. It's uncertainty. So we have two primary levels of impact that have been identified already, as I said, economic dimension and health dimension. In case of low level impacts on both dimensions, we could find ourselves in a scenario one, which is basically the situation we are in, with major disruption, yes, but still not an escalating crisis where health would go, the health situation would get worse, even worse than it is today, and the economic impact could translate into a protracted crisis, and eventually in scenario three, collapsing of the system. So this is not fantasy. These are real scenarios that most researchers are working with. Obviously, we all hope that we will remain in the scenario one, that is a manageable disruption, although it is already quite substantial. So how does that translate, these kind of scenarios on uncertainty in the rice-based agri-food sector? So as you can see in scenario, the first word is uncertainty, because nobody knows how long the situation will last and how deep the crisis will be. Interestingly, we have also seen that while it started as a health crisis, the response to the crisis have been the many types of response have been more impacting the economies than the health situation itself. So social distancing measures, for example, have created a number of situations that have compounded some of the long trends in, for example, climate change, political instability, weather issues that were already somehow threatening the stability of agri-food systems. So the scenarios we are working with are distinguishing what we call the first order effects, or the immediate effects of the crisis, and the second order effects that are derived from these first order effects, and also the responses. And so how are agents in the economies or in the rice sector, for example, responding to these measures? And that has also implications from behaviors. We see that agents, you, me, have been changing the way they behave in the face of the crisis, probably not doing things that you used to do. And that is also true for a number of activities in the rural and agricultural sectors. So we have seen in the first order effect drop in demand, that is very clear. The video clearly shows the labor issues related to migration and the lack of availability of labor to pick up the fruits, to pick up the vegetables, but also for harvest and other types of crops. So that may have consequences on planting, may have consequences on harvesting, and that will probably, if it continues, affect the volume of production, which would be quite preoccupying. But that has also led to some secondary or second order effects, like unemployment, dramatic erosions of incomes, liquidity constraints, lack of ability to invest, and also some responses from the governments that have been either spending more or spending less, depending on the activities and the sector, more or less policy coordination, stricter border control in some cases, although you just show the video where Thailand is a good example of a country that did all what it could to keep borders open. But you have also have seen some panic buying in a number of cases with consumers, going to the supermarkets and make sure that they could food stockpile. You have also people who have changed the way they see the future with a change in expectations and in spending propensity. All that has implications in the way the economy works, and the rice sector has operated in terms of productivity, for example. Well, when you have labor shortages, the productivity of labor, of course, goes down, and you have a number of issues related to food supply, but it could have implications on food security and nutrition. You have also the wage workers that have been laid off and cannot work, and so on. So very, very important impacts on livelihoods and poverty. So this slide is not, I will be very quick on that one, is just to show the complexity of the system. This depicts an economy and the economic, how the economic cycle is actually impacted. The blue boxes indicate the main institutions of the economy: households, government, businesses, the rest of the world, the financial sector, and basically you see these red crosses all over. So all these red crosses indicates, the bottlenecks, all the flows of goods or services or capital that have been impacted. So that explains the unique characteristic of this crisis, which is both affecting the supply and the demand. And that is somehow unprecedented. In 2018 and 2008 and 2010, we saw a crisis that was basically driven by supply. And we have here a case that is unique. The effect is, as you can see here, a dramatic drop is the red line and the green line. So the pessimistic scenario is the red line, where you see a merchandise trade volume that is going as far down as it was in 2008, for example. A less pessimistic scenario in the green line would still see that there would be a huge deviation from the trend of expected trade. So trade is probably one of the sectors that will be dramatically impacted by the crisis. So here we try to zoom in what could happen in the rice value chain. So as I said, and I will try to be quite fast on that, but again, what emerges from that, and it's not intentional, it's just trying to depict the reality, is complexity. You see that many variables, many dimensions are affected by the crisis. So you have this risk and vulnerability, the mobility restrictions, border closure, quarantine, social distance, health safety, and so on, that have actually led to some drivers and constraints, including, a shortage of inputs, labor, transport. The video is very good on that. It's showing all these dimensions, and that goes down to the policies, which basically in the middle shows that all the value chain has been more or less and often more impacted. Inputs, production, processing, marketing, and trade and consumption. The video shows that as well, and many governments have been quite keen to show that there are ways to reassure consumers that supply would be maintained, and the outcomes and the impact are obviously very preoccupying. Where you see that producer prices, as the video showed, they may have either dropped, or the consumer prices may have already sparked. And so you have a price gap that has been increasing, and that is also preoccupying, because it means that the price asymmetries and the connections and the leakages within the value chains are destabilized, and you have seen a change in market behaviors, and of course with dramatic implications in terms of rural employment. For those of you who are well aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, what we have tried to show here is that basically all of them, or most of them, are affected, starting from the one on poverty, hunger, and the environment, partnerships. All these are Sustainable Development Goals that are impacted in one way or another by COVID, and often negatively, while some, for example, indicators on the environment are impacting positively. We have seen that air quality has improved. We have seen that, for example, biodiversity has been measured as shrinking less. You have seen issues of greenhouse gas emissions being dramatically reduced, of course, and so this is, of course, questioning the way our economies work. So turning back to the rice sector, we see three major channels through which the value chains have been impacted, and that would need to be monitored carefully. In those countries where mechanization levels are low, labor shortage, migration, people returning back to their home country, for example, or rising labor costs would have to be monitored. This is likely to affect and constrain the rice economy dramatically. Logistics, transport, distribution networks, all that has been impacting the supply of goods, including inputs for production. So that is something that probably was overlooked in the past. We have had the tendency to consider that the middle chain is just a bunch of operators that operate effectively and efficiently, while the crisis has shown that this is a very fragile and very vulnerable segment of the value chain that would actually require more attention. And then you have also as the previous slide has shown, the capital flow. And there is no activities in agriculture, in rice production without a credit. And the drop, for example, in remittances, workers, for example, in the case of the Philippines, workers that have migrated to the Middle East, for example, and who could not send money back home anymore, this is likely to affect production in the short run. However, as probably most of you are thinking, is the situation very dire and strained? No, for the time being, the market fundamentals are good. The previous harvests were good, so the level of stocks and the level of supply in rice is absolutely acceptable. So there is no reason to worry in the short run. However, this could change in the medium run. The medium run for me means in the next harvest, for example, starting with the next harvest. If the production is not good, then we could see a dramatic change in the picture of the outlook for the rice market. So what it could look like, for example, just looking at trade and the effects on prices of some trade restrictions, assume that the country like Vietnam or joined by Cambodia, for example, would impose a ban, you would see the price that would skyrocket again. And in a situation that could become very similar to the one we have observed in 28. And of course, that could be aggravated if some countries, big players like China, for example, could make decisions to import more. That is not currently the case. China is close to a situation of exporting rice, but who knows? Who knows if the production is not as good as expected? So here is just a slide very quickly to show the impact of such bans, trade policies that would actually, try to insulate domestic markets. If they were imposed only on rice, you can see this is the purple bar. You would see that the rice price would skyrocket again, plus 30%, which is basically the difference between December 2019 to the last quotations available for April. So plus 30%. That's noticeable, and you have also an effect on aggregate cereal prices. So the increase in rice price would drive the overall increase in cereal price, which is of course concerning. Here you see the distribution. So you see that while the whole world on the right-hand corner of the graph, it would be affected. Some regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia would be more affected than others, of course, because they are basically the rice basket. And so that is also something to look at in terms of distributions of the impact of a rise in prices. And so that will have also dramatic consequences in terms of poverty. And overall in the world, we could see an increase in the number of poor by 20%. So that is a work that was done with colleagues at IFPRI, and we show that again the distribution is uneven. You would see some regions more affected than others, particularly in rural areas in some cases. So that's quite interesting to note. But overall, we could witness a situation we would have 140 million poor in addition, below the poverty line. So that is quite concerning. So the lessons learned, as you have seen in the video, is very interesting, because we have seen that some countries, Vietnam, for example, have made additional efforts to inform the situation and make sure that they collect data, that they also disseminate this information to make sure that players in the value chains are receiving the information they need to respond. Other countries have actually, boosted the already existing programs on technologies and mechanization, for example, to make sure that they would compensate for labor shortage. That's interesting. Singapore, of course, an advanced economy, but has demonstrated a huge capacity to actually look at what is happening to the middle chain. Of course, Singapore is dependent on this trade for its economy, but that was unseen before. So this direct attention to the middle chain, and I think this is very important for the future. Countries making sure that they would maintain open borders. Not all. We have seen some countries that for a short while have closed their borders and have sent the wrong signal to a number of trade partners, including, for example, the Philippines, or Indonesia, but as massive important countries were quite preoccupied to see that borders could close. Other countries have increase their cash transfers, making sure that the poorest would receive assistance, and also invested in digital services, making sure that since connections and social life was more difficult, that could be compensated with modern technologies like digital services. So these are quite interesting, responses that we have seen. So altogether, we could say that the critical response to this crisis involved many dimensions. That is due to the complexity. First, protect health, of course, of workers everywhere, maintain trade open, monitor and assess the situation to actually make sure that you prepare for a good response as early as possible, expand and optimize social protection schemes to actually protect the most vulnerable, and especially those who have lost incomes. You see, I have a problem here. Oops. Keep agriculture production and food supply chain functioning. So here again, I insist on that. The middle chain, making sure that logistics function well, that these platforms to actually regulate trade would operate effectively, maintain food aid to ensure that those who are again vulnerable and exposed to hunger and malnutrition could still receive food in times of needs, support the liquidity to make sure that the credit crunch would not materialize, and still farmers could actually invest for the season and planting, and make sure that they would actually have all the liquidities necessary to invest in seeds and fertilizers, for example. Develop, that is a more long-term issue, public investment in support of mechanization, so in productivity enhancing technology, make sure that the level of dependence on labor could be reduced. And the last 2 points are critically important. International coordination to actually make sure that policy developments are harmonized, and foster international cooperation to provide timely and sufficient aid where it is needed. So that is also about targeting. So this is my last slide, where I would like to emphasize some take-home message. And that these are not necessarily specific to the rice sector, because I think one thing that the crisis has shown is that the rice sector and the rice-based systems are fully integrated in the economy and very much dependent on what happens in the rest of the economy. And because in the end, it is not a rice crisis. It is a crisis that has started elsewhere, but has translated into something that is affecting the rice sector. So we need to understand this complexity and this the multifaceted crisis that we are witnessing, and that is still unfolding. So uncertainty, vulnerability, and interdependence are key features. So we know that we cannot continue thinking as was the case in the past. We are vulnerable to sometimes something that is depicted as an enemy but is not visible, but that and we are interdependent. That is quite important to keep in mind. There are short-term, long-term, and medium-term and long-term issues, and that is likely, as I said, likely to impact dramatically some very important dimensions such as food security, nutrition, poverty, equity, but also the environment. And so not necessarily always in the same direction. And that is also quite interesting to note. COVID, and you all see that in your own lives, has already changed many things. It has changed the way we relate to each other. It has changed the way we think about ourselves and our relations, but it has also changed the way we think about economic development. And some paradigms that were very well entrenched, for example, globalization, or the role of trade, are being challenged. And we see governments now questioning that. And the problem is that probably we see that it will be unlikely to go back to the normal situation, the pre-COVID, but we don't know what the new normal will be. Rice farmers, consumers, and the middle agents are all exposed and vulnerable. And they are exposed to these invisible enemy. It means this is something that they don't control. And so they have to adapt. That is another message that is very important, to actually make sure that they become resilient to something that is beyond them. And the one lesson that we have probably to learn is that there is this interconnection between different systems, animal, human, and environment. This is very often referred to as one health. And it is also for us to reflect on how we want to actually make sure that these systems talk to each other and operate in synergy rather than in competition. And the last point is preparedness, because the same causes are likely to produce the same effects. And if nothing changes, we can expect a new crisis. And so what is it that needs to be done to prepare in case a new crisis emerges? Or what is it that needs to be done to actually make sure that we make our rice-based food system more resilient, and probably operating in slightly different ways to make sure that we avoid a crisis? With that, I thank you very much.
And it was really in-depth of information about the rice sector. I noticed from your explanation that we are already having a lot of challenges in the agriculture sector due to climate change, political instability, and in addition with COVID-19 has compounded or added the impact to the worse, by which the productivity, food supply, and food security are in stake now. In particular, the whole rice value chains are affected a lot in terms of supply, demand, production cost, input, consumer prices. And it was very well explained. Thanks for that. And also you were mentioning that the world merchandise trade volume in 2020, even in the less pessimistic way, it will be have the similar effect of 2008. That's really actually concern point. And you have added the very important point that on policy development, we need to have an international coordination, which is a really, really very important immediate need of the hour, that international organizations should look at those points. And thank you very much for all these explanations. Now we are open for the floor for questions. Let me start with my question. In one of your slides, you are explaining the export ban scenario and how the rice price would increase accordingly. That was a really very intuitive analysis and the need of the hour. On the note, I would like to ask one question. According to the USDA data, over half of the world's 466 million tons of rice inventory currently resides in China, roughly say around 230 million tons. It means China could decide what it would like to do, or how it handles the rice stocks will have a significant ripples in the worldwide. Especially in Asia, the food security is largely linked with the food availability and affordability of the rice, and it is the most important staple for the majority of the population in Asia. So how do you foresee this scenario and how it could impact the food security in Asia? Or in other words, how other Asian nations should prepare for this kind of worst case scenario during current crisis and post-COVID?
Yes, thank you for that, Asai. So there are many dimensions in your question. One relates to supply and what could happen to production, what relates to price, and what relates to the role of China in how that could play out. So as I said in my presentation, I think in the short run, in the next 3 months, and we have seen that, there is no reason to be concerned about food supply. I mean, rice supply at least, and because the past harvest and the production levels and the stocks are very good. Nothing that is comparable to the situation in 28, where stocks were very low. And as you said, China plays a critical role in that, but also India and others. I mean, overall, the stocks are quite high. So that is the first point. The second point is what you were saying. Yes, the price could have already started to increase. As I said, we have moved from a situation where we were in December around 432, something like that, US dollars per ton in December, to a situation today or recently where we are close to 565 US dollar per tons. So that is roughly a 30% increase in only 4 months. That's substantial. That denotes something that is going on in the markets, and we have some anticipations here. That is also interesting because it is not happening with other cereals. The maize and wheat markets are rather flat or declining in the case of wheat, for example. And so we can see that if something happens in the still relatively thin rice market, because altogether rice trade only represents 9% of the overall production, so it is still a very thin market compared to others. So a slight change in terms of, for example, trade policies could have very important ripple effects, and that is preoccupying. So back to the role of China. Well, obviously China is one key player, if not the key player. China is a massive is the first producer, the first consumer, possesses the highest level of stocks. So, but China is doing pretty good in terms of productivity, in terms of self-sufficiency. Of course, China is such a big country that it can do basically whatever it wants. So, should China decide to buy more rice, basically at any price, it could do it, and that could have consequences. I don't think that this is a plausible scenario in the short run, because we don't see why China would do that. China still have productivity, reserves, could still decide to increase its own production. But the dramatic scenario that we show, this is the extreme scenario that we show, is that we could go back to a situation that could be comparable to the one we faced in 28 if a number of countries would decide to make, to take a direction that would not align and would not be coordinated. And that is what worries me. Making sure that we have learned the lessons, and it seems we have. It seems that we are in a much better position than what we were in 28, but we need to continue on that path, making sure that governments continue to talk to each other.
Thanks, Dr. Jin. I think that's well understood that China would not go for such a drastic steps, and we will hope for the best scenarios should come for our farmers. And now we have the questions from the audience. Yeah, Mr. Thomas Smith. So how the international organization like World Food Program can work with the governments of developing countries?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, let me make a remark first. I think APO and other international organizations like the WFP, FAO, IFAD, and others have a tremendous role to play. These are the representative of the multilateral system. So basically, the common good, the interest of nations that the interest that nations have to cooperate. So I think it is very important to recognize that. And as for the WFP, it has a very specific mandate, which is providing assistance in case of emergency. And so the first thing that the WFP can do with governments is basically engage in a dialogue, making sure that they provide or receive the information they need to detect the situations of pre-crisis, where we already have signs that the situation could deteriorate fast. The least we want to see is that we intervene at the moment the crisis is already there. So it is all about preparation, making sure that the WFP with governments are able to anticipate this crisis, because it is too late to actually channel food aid, for example, when you have already people starving. So that is the first thing that they can do. The second thing that they can do is what they call, I don't know exactly that terminology, but this kind of assessment, vulnerability assessment, making sure that they screen the situation in terms of production, the regions that are likely to have deficits in food, those that are likely to be in surplus, and make sure that within countries, for example, they connect surplus and deficit areas. That is another thing that they can do through this kind of diagnostic. And the third thing that they can do is to actually sit, next to governments and play the role of a policy advisor, for example, together with FAO, and say, okay, let's have a look at the policies that you have in place, and what would be the best measures that could help drive, the situation, or actually improve the situation throughout the crisis, and try to avoid these so-called bad policies, the things that would actually make things worse, like, for example, closing borders, or making sure that closing borders could have a positive effect for the country at stake, but would have negative effects for all the others. So that is what we want to avoid. So the WFP and other international agencies can draw the attention on this kind of uncooperative policies.
Thanks, Dr. Jin. I think that's very well explained, that we need to focus on the vulnerability assessment, and also the policy advocacy is the need of the hour. Then all international organizations should get in contact and create the suitable policy for this kind of a crisis. And we have a next question from our participant, Mr. John Trevor from Bangkok. And his question is, some countries are reluctant to export rice and some staple crops abroad. So what could you suggest to resolve this issue?
First of all, thank you for the question. I think it's a good question, another one. And second of all, I think it is important to recognize why some countries could be reluctant to export rice in particular. And that needs to be understood. I think governments are not operating irrationally. They are rational actors. But the primary objective of a government is to satisfy its own constituents, and that needs to be understood. So the problem with this kind of policies, and we have seen that recently in Vietnam, for example, and luckily Vietnam has stopped that. After a few weeks, they returned to normal, what we would consider normal, and reopened trade, because probably they realized that that was doing more harm than good. The problem with this kind of policies is that it's a collective action problem, if you want. It's a bit like, if you're in a stadium, one person stands up to have a better view at the game, that's good for the person. But if everyone does that, well, the situation is bad for everyone, and nobody sees anymore. That's a bit the same thing for trade. It's basically making sure that you don't have this kind of chain reaction where one government operating in isolation and in a selfish way is actually triggering a response by other governments to actually do the same thing and close borders, insulate its economy, and basically aggravate the situation for everybody as a result. So that basically the key message. And to prevent that, I think it is It is just to actually sit down and discuss, making sure that we help governments find other solutions, making sure that, for example, we help create um, dialogue on a regional basis. For example, ASEAN countries have long been talking about creating a single market or integrated market, at least for rice. It would perhaps be time to actually resume this discussion and making sure that we create this kind of free trade area within ASEAN countries on rice. These are the kind of responses that could actually avoid situations where we have to go for rice export bans.
Thank you, Dr. Jin. I think that was really explained the situations of what had happened in Vietnam, and definitely it could have been short of the domestic rice price, and also the need of the hour is that Asian countries, ASEAN countries need to have the kind of a very productivity dialogues to create a to avoid the trade barriers regionalization. I think that would solve the problems, especially for this kind of commodity product like rice. And we have the questions from another participants name called Call Wicket from New York. We have many stockpiling cases. We all know that this is not the right, but it's also true that it's very worrisome. How do you think that we have to respond to this crisis?
Yeah, I think we have to treat people and governments with respect on that. I think this is not the expression of craziness. People are just actually trying to shield themselves from situations that are actually very or could be very worrisome. The difference is that we need to distinguish what is the reality and what is fiction. And very often, unfortunately, we have reactions that are triggered by fear as opposed to evidence. And so I think the best way to actually avoid this kind of panic buying or inadequate policy response, depending on the level we look at things, is actually to make sure that we provide reliable information to consumers, to producers, to traders, that, as was very well shown in the video, that there is enough food for the moment, and we have guarantees that the supply chain will not be interrupted. So that this is probably likely to be more conducive to a faster return to normal, or whatever this new normal will be, rather than fueling these kind of fears. And of course, you have differences. The market of rice is not the same as the market of vegetables for very obvious reasons. I mean, these are perishable, and rice is not. And so, of course, you have tensions that are a bit inevitable when logistics, for example, are not working properly. You may have a little bit of shortage on fresh products, but I think that by and large, if things are well explained, consumers can understand that and can adapt. So it is a matter of days or weeks of adjustment, but there is no reason to panic when the fundamentals are good.
Thank you, Dr. Jin. I think the point is we should not get panic, and the stockpiling is not the way we have to behave during this crisis, because we may expect a second wave, third wave also, this kind of infection. So we need to prepare for that kind of crisis rather than stockpiling and unnecessarily creating the panic among the buyers. So now we have a question from India, Dr. Sashi Vemuri. Is the present scenario, what will be the plans for rice scientists to meet the likely food security issues likely to which arises, and the climate changes, and what are the effects on the production? Especially for rice.
Sorry, it cut a little bit at some point, so I didn't get all the questions. So if you could repeat that, because it was long and I got interrupted.
Let me explain once again. So under the current scenario, what will be the plans for the rice scientist to meet the likely food security issues, for example, under the climate changes, or that could affect the production, right? So under this scenario, what could be the plan for the rice scientists?
Very good question again. I like it because it allows me to draw our attention to the fact that the COVID crisis has not made the other looming crisis or disappear. We still have a climate crisis that we have to fight as well, and we have a number of issues with biodiversity, and we have a number of other issues with weather, hazards. So that's a good question, because it only shows that we have an addition of problems that are piling up, and science can help. Can make as its share and can do a number of things. So, for example, what rice scientists are currently doing is, as you probably know, working on climate adapted varieties of rice. So making sure that we can grow rice in different ecosystems that would be exposed or vulnerable to different types of weather shocks. The other thing that rice scientists are doing is working on agronomic practices, the so-called climate adapted practices. So making sure that, for example, we have a more efficient use of water, or that the use of fertilizer is better controlled. We also have a lot of work that is being done on precision agriculture, making sure that, for example, we use the cropping calendar more effectively and more accurately to make sure that we plant at the right time. That, for example, we use the whole benefit of these shorter duration varieties that would actually make it faster to harvest, while maintaining the level of yields. So all that are the things that science can do. However, there are things that science alone cannot do. For example, we rely on others to make sure that the incentives are there, that markets operate efficiently, that institutions are in place to actually make sure that, for example, these technologies are disseminated and are adapted and adopted. So this is also something that rice scientists and others need to be thinking about more, is actually how do we engage with others to make sure that a number of these innovations and technologies are actually not only on the shelf, but are used widely and in the field. And that means that we increasingly need to work in partnerships.
Thank you very much for that very good explanations. And now we have another question from Mr. Chen Chan. And in the poorest countries, food accounts for almost 40 to 60% for the consumption basket, about 5 to 6 times its share in advanced economies. It seems urgent help is necessary. What kind of advice would you give?
Yes, well, that is a fact, and poor households typically spend more of their income on food, because that is a necessity, for them spending. So the advice I can give is basically the development paradigm is making sure that as fast as possible we lift people out of poverty, and we make sure that an increasing share of their income is devoted to other things than food or clothing, or to actually be able to invest in education for their kids, making sure that they can spend more on health, and so on. That is all the development agenda. What needs to be done for that? One key lever for that is productivity, making sure that we develop agriculture system that can deliver more with fewer. inputs. And so making sure that we become more and more efficient, and that the returns increase to investment in agriculture. So that is a role for, again, science, but it's also a role for policies, making sure that we create this enabling environment for people to make a living out of agriculture. That said, agriculture is not going to be, and that is something that is very personal, but I don't think agriculture is going to solve it all on its own. It is likely that we will see, and we'll have to see, people moving out of agriculture. That is a trend that has been seen in many developing countries already. My country, for example, has 3% of people in agriculture, less, and that represents 1.5% of the GDP of the country. So that is the transformation of the economies. So making sure that agriculturalists are not left behind, but participate in the economy and as recognized as key player of the whole economy and live decent lives.
That's very well said, Dr. Jean. That's a very, very important point, that we should not leave the agriculture behind. It should contribute and participate in the economy of GDP in each country. I think that's a very important message. I have another question from Mr. Antonio Bendores. You have been mentioning that the global policy coordination is very much essential to prevent the food crisis. But how can we make governments work together? Because each government has their own priority and interest. So how do we make them to work together?
That again, a very good question. So we are clearly moving out of rice here, and let me be a bit speculative. So there is no denying here. It is not easy to make governments work together. History has shown that this is a big challenge, and today we see, countries that are not ready to compromise, are not ready to honestly talk to each other, big powers that are just, playing the game of, opposition. So the challenge is huge. It's clear. But we also have a number of very good examples. We have, for a long time, the United Nations have been, a place where government can talk. You have fantastic stories. The European Union, for example, where countries that had been at war for centuries are actually cooperating, and that happens. It's not perfect, far from that. A lot of hiccups and hilly, bumpy journey, but it happens when the interest of nations, is higher than the interest of a few. Then you can find a way to make governments cooperate. The climate change negotiations are a sad story so far, where we can see that governments are not ready to actually cooperate in the interest of the next generations. Everybody knows that it is time to do something about it. Everybody knows that we are already late, and governments are just delaying and delaying and delaying. So it is also a matter of civil societies, population, to exercise the required pressure on governments to actually make sure that they do what needs to be done.
Thank you, Dr. Jin. I think this is a very difficult questions to answer. And thanks for your speculative one, because especially if you take the example of the climate change, it's very difficult to coordinate all the world leaders, because they had a promise, but somehow because of the power, they just withdraw and they go on their own. So it's a kind of very difficult to manage and coordinate, and really difficult, challenging one. And thanks for your speculative answer, well received. And we have another question from our participant, Sutat Sembong Sam. Sorry, my pronunciation may not be good. So has IRI looked into the possibility that there could be an outbreak of virus on rice that could be substantially reduce the production of rice? This is a very biological oriented question. So do you have a...
Yes, it's a very, very, very important question, and yes, we are looking at that. the difficulty with that, and clearly that is not my personal field of expertise. I am an economist, but we have colleagues and under our supervision that are looking at these issues. The real problem is that we are fighting the unknown, and the known unknown, or the unknown unknown. And so that is very, very, very difficult, of course. So we have a number of researchers that are looking at patterns of diseases regarding locations, but also exposure and vulnerability of some varieties in specific ecosystems, and looking at the type of diseases, not only viruses, but also other types of bacteria or diseases that could actually affect crop and lead to failure of crops. So that is an important program of work that we have. That said, and we work on partnership on that because we cannot pretend we can cover every scenario. We also cannot be sure that we are prepared for a virus or a disease that is not known. So preparation is good, but fighting the unknown is difficult.
Thank you very much for that answer. And let me ask the last question because we are running out of time. So, IRRI, as being a global premier organization dedicated for the rice research, what is your kind of initiatives you have taken, especially for the COVID-related initiatives, for the current situation and also for the post-COVID? What are your initiatives as a premier organizations you have taken so far?
So thanks again for the question. So IRRI has been on the front line to in the COVID development. So the first thing that we have done, of course, is get in touch with governments, making sure that we would work with them to understand the situation. There is nothing that can be done without evidence. So trying to get a better understanding of the situation in the field, where the big hotspots and the big issues. The second thing that we have done is try to look at funding partners for the situations where the problems are very acute and severe, making sure that the resources could be channeled. So the multilateral systems has been of great assistance in that. For example, the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank are already looking at ways they can alleviate some of the issues. And the third thing that we have done is actually what I was presenting before, is scenarios development and trying to look at what can we anticipate? What are the research areas where IRRI could try to make a breakthrough and look at possible solutions? And one of them is certainly resilience, making sure that we develop rice agri-food systems, and not only rice, making sure that we look at systems approach, that farmers are increasingly understood as being embedded in a web of networks that have to do with livelihoods, have to do with markets, have to do with education, have to do with provisions of infrastructure. So really look at that through a system lens, as opposed to monocropping, for example. IRRI is increasingly moving, towards a rice-based agri-food system and putting the emphasis on diversification. IRRI is not to say that rice needs to be grown everywhere. Rice is part of the solution, including on nutrition, but it has a role to play. It's not the panacea. And in a number of cases, we need to identify where rice is going to be part of the solution, where it could lead to healthy diets, where it could actually help people get out of poverty or stabilize incomes. But we need to understand that farmers are going to improve their livelihoods through diversification.
Thank you for that great explanations. Sorry, I will have one more questions. We are keep getting questions. Let me take the final one. Sorry about it. And this is from Thomas Smith. The continent is more dependent on food externally sourced. but countries are reducing exports, meaning Africa can't import the supplies it needs. What is your insights on that?
Well, I guess the continent that is referred to here is Africa, because Asia is in a different situation, at least with respect to rice. Asia is clearly a net exporter. So now, regarding Africa, I fully agree. And IRI is increasingly working in Africa. Last year, the continent imported roughly $6 billion worth of rice. That gives the order of magnitude in terms of dependency on imports. And for other crops as well. So yes, there is an issue of food sovereignty in Africa that is serious. At the same time, it is important to recognize that Africa has a huge untapped potential. I mean, by many measures, Africa could become, one of the food baskets of the world. It has abundance of land. It has water in some areas, not everywhere, but it has also, favorable ecosystems. So what really is needed is to actually tap this potential. Make sure that we invest in agriculture in Africa. Make sure that we build these rural economies that could actually transform and become more productive and more efficient. We have a huge productivity gap in Africa in rice or in other sectors that could be filled through adequate technologies, better policies, better market connections, and cooperation.
Thank you very much for the great explanations. Now it's time to end up our sessions. And thank you very much, Dr. Jean, for your valuable insights. And I believe all our participants found your information very insightful and useful. And due to the time limitations, we are unable to take more questions. I would request to post the questions in the chat box, and we will respond to you as soon as possible. And the APO Productivity Talk will be held every Tuesday and Thursday on different topics by world-leading experts. So please subscribe this APO channel and stay tuned, stay safe and happy. And goodbye.
Thank you for having me.